You seem thoughtful tonight. What's on your mind?
I was just thinking about how often we say someday when we talk about things we want to do.
Like my plan to start exercising someday?
Exactly. Or how I keep saying I'll learn to play the piano someday.
You're right, we all do it. Why do you bring this up?
I have a story in mind that might help us think differently about it. It's about a young man named Mark who kept saying someday until he realized how it was holding him back.
Sounds like a good story. I'd love to hear it.
Once upon a time, in a bustling city filled with bright lights and busy people, lived a young man named Mark. He was in his late 20s, smart and full of dreams. Mark had always been fascinated by the idea of writing a book. He often imagined himself at a book signing event, smiling as readers lined up to get his autograph. He pictured his name on the bestseller list, his story inspiring millions. But there was one problem. Mark always told himself he would start someday. Every day, Mark went to his job at a corporate office. He spent his evenings scrolling through social media, watching YouTube videos, or browsing online stores. Every once in a while, he would think about his book and say to himself, "I'll start writing it someday." Someday became his go-to word, his shield against the nagging thought that he wasn't pursuing his passion. Meanwhile, in the same city, there lived an elderly woman named Mrs. Collins. She was in her late 70s with silver hair and a kind smile. Mrs. Collins had a little garden where she grew the most beautiful flowers. Her garden was her pride and joy, and every morning she would wake up with the sun to water her plants, remove the weeds, and talk to her flowers. To everyone who asked about her secret to a happy life, she would say, "Don't wait for someday, make today the day." Mark and Mrs. Collins crossed paths often, as they lived in the same neighborhood. One day, Mark noticed Mrs. Collins in her garden and decided to strike up a conversation. They exchanged pleasantries, and soon enough, Mark found himself pouring out his heart to her, sharing his dream of writing a book. "That's wonderful," Mrs. Collins exclaimed with a sparkle in her eye. "So, when are you going to start?" Mark shrugged, his usual response ready on his lips. "Someday," he said, smiling. Mrs. Collins's face turned serious. "Someday," she repeated softly. "You know, Mark, someday is the worst word in the dictionary. It's a word that allows people to wait until it's too late." Mark felt a bit defensive. "But I don't have time. My job keeps me busy and there's always something else that comes up." Mrs. Collins nodded, understandingly. "We all have the same 24 hours in a day, dear. The difference lies in how we choose to use them. When people say they don't have time, it means they have something else that they've decided is more important. And that's fine. But don't blame time. If you can spend hours on Instagram or YouTube, where does that time come from?" Mark was taken aback. He had never thought about it that way. He thanked Mrs. Collins and left, but her words kept echoing in his mind. That evening, as he sat down with his phone in hand, ready to dive into his usual social media routine, he paused. He thought about all the times he had said, "someday." He realized that someday had become a comfortable excuse, a way to avoid the fear of starting something new, something uncertain. Days passed, and Mark couldn't shake off the conversation. He started noticing how often he used the word someday. "Someday I'll call my parents more often. Someday I'll take that trip. Someday I'll learn how to cook." The more he noticed, the more he realized that he was filling his life with excuses. One day, Mark decided to do something different. He came home from work, put his phone away, and sat down with a blank piece of paper. He wrote, Chapter 1. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And from that day on, Mark made a promise to himself. No more someday. He would find time, even if it was just a few minutes a day, to work on his book. Weeks turned into months, and soon Mark had written several chapters. The more he wrote, the more he felt alive. He found joy in the creative process, and surprisingly, he still managed to keep up with his job. his social life, and even a little social media time. But now, he was living with purpose. One afternoon, Mark visited Mrs. Collins to thank her for the advice that had changed his life. "You were right," he admitted. "Someday really is the worst word." Mrs. Collins smiled warmly. "I'm glad you realize that, Mark. You see, life doesn't wait, and time? Time is always moving. It doesn't care if you're ready or not. But if you start now today, you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," he said sincerely. Years went by, and Mark's book became a reality. He published it, and to his surprise, it resonated with many readers. At the book signing event he had once dreamed about, he saw Mrs. Collins in the crowd. He smiled at her, and Mark knew, in that moment, that he had made the right choice. Someday is a word that delays dreams, pushes away potential, and keeps us waiting until it's too late. Time is not the enemy, it is the choices we make with it. Don't wait for the perfect moment or the right time to do what you love. Start today and turn someday into today. As the story ends, remember, the next time you catch yourself saying someday, ask yourself what's stopping you from making it today.
That was a powerful story. It makes you realize how much we let someday hold us back.
Exactly. We get so comfortable with putting things off, thinking we have all the time in the world.
You know what? I think I'm going to start working on my someday list tonight. Maybe it's time to finally pick up that guitar I bought years ago.
And I think I'll start looking up some piano lessons. No more waiting for someday.
Deal. Let's turn our somedays into todays.